Hello, everyone. My name is Marcin Siedlarz, and I'm from FireEye's Advanced Practices team. Our Advanced Practices team consists of two sub-teams. One of them is Adversary Pursuit. I'm the member of this team, and our core mission is to pursue groups that matter across FireEye's ecosystem. There's some sort of adjacent team called Adversary Methods, and Daniel Bohannon that presented yesterday is a member of this team, and their core mission is to apply the knowledge of attackers' tradecraft in order to develop actionable signals and detect groups that matter. I'm going to talk today about threat intelligence and how we do it, but before I dive into the details, let me quickly introduce myself and the idea behind this presentation. I'm sorry for that. I have a little bit of over 9 years experience in responding to some of the most prolific threat actors around this world. My career in computer security industry started when I joined Polish governmental CERT, where we responded to a number of nation-state-sponsored intrusions from both Chinese and Russian groups. I moved after a couple of years to a private sector where I contributed to Dragonfly research and white paper that was later published by Symantec around 2014. At FireEye, I conduct research into various advanced persistent threats, in particular groups from China and other Southeast Asian countries. The major takeaway from this presentation for you is that I would like you to realize that everything is connected to everything else. It is a famous quote by Leonardo da Vinci, and I'm going to show you how I stumbled upon this. I was walking in Singapore's Museum of Art and Science, and I saw this huge wall with this picture. I took a photo of it, and what struck me in this picture is the concept of nodes and edges. The nodes are the dots, and the edges are the lines connecting them, and the whole paradigm of everything being connected to everything else. When I was thinking a little bit more about this topic, I researched the presentations given by other vendors and other analysts, and everyone is talking about cool advanced persistent threat campaigns, clever intrusion techniques, but no one really explains how they do their analysis. So today I'm going to show you how we do it at FireEye. But before we go into the details of intelligence analysis, I want to talk a little bit about intelligence objectives. The main intelligence objective is to reduce uncertainty, and intelligence reduces uncertainty by providing knowledge. The knowledge that is accurate, timely, and relevant, and it has to pertain to either threat intel landscape, cyber. It can also pertain to war field or politics. The knowledge that intelligence provides has to be about the threat and the surrounding environment. Let me talk about what threat intelligence is both for me and for our team. For us, threat intelligence basically means visibility on threat actors, exploits, and malware. It can be both tactical, where the analysts focus on TTPs, indicators, and artifacts. It can also be strategic, where you focus on how TTPs change over time, what kind of industries are targeted, what kind of data is stolen. You analyze motivations and I can, and who benefits from the intrusions, as well as analysis of the attacker's infrastructure. But most importantly, threat intelligence is all about attribution capability. And what I mean by attribution capability is being able to take this and imagine that you are doing a lot of incident response engagements in your infrastructure. You come up with a couple of incidents over time, and you gather a bunch of indicators of compromise that you have to analyze and basically go from this to something like this. You have IOCs, then you have to bundle them together, tag them, discover tools, tactics, procedures, and overlaps, and you have to go from basic set of IOCs to a whole fully flavored APT group. So if I show you again the picture that I took in Singapore, you can clearly see the idea of nodes and edges in this picture. And for us, nodes are basically indicators of compromise that are connected by different edges. And in order to bring this whole idea of nodes and edges closer to you, I want to give you an example of tracking the cars. This is a very basic example. So let's say we want to track the cars, and we have to create the node, car node, and we have to come up with a set of properties that we want to store in our database about the car. One of these properties would definitely be a VIN number, that is some sort of unique identifier for a car. The other one would be a color, and if we want to track the age of the car, we would store another property like a manufacturing date. Someone would argue, okay, maybe we can track registration plates, but because car can have many registration plates, we would actually create another node for this called registration plate and also store different properties for this node. One of them would be a number, and the other one, let's say, would be a registration date. So we have two nodes already. We want to create another one for the person node because people own cars, right? So what would be the properties of a person node that we want to track? Definitely first name and the last name, and for example, birth date. So this is a very basic model for tracking cars, and we have only three nodes in this model. What would be the edges that we can connect all these nodes together? So a car can have a registration plate, and the node car is connected to registration plate by edge called car has reg, and the person can also have a car, and these two nodes are connected by person has car edge. Someone would argue that person can also have a registration plate, but this is just a presentation of idea of nodes and edges, so it doesn't matter in this example. What kind of queries we would like to run if we want to track the cars? For example, give me all red cars manufactured in 2012, or give me all red cars belonging to a male that is between 25 and 25 years old, sedan. The car type is sedan, registration plate starts with the W. If we would like to actually issue this query, we would have to extend our model because we didn't store any type of a car in our model. So how does this pertain to a cyber threat data model? I'm going to give you a couple of examples from the cyber realm, from the cyber threat tracking database, and these will be very basic examples, for example, in terms of malware communications. Let's start with malware comms. We've got two nodes. The one on the left is a file, the one on the right is a FQDN, basically a domain name, and these two can be bundled together with the run DNS lookup edge. Basically means that the file resolves a domain name upon execution. The other example is run connect edge, and it basically describes a scenario where a file upon execution connects to a certain port or on certain IP address. This is a node called IPv4 server. The last example of malware comms would be run get URL edge that connects file and the URL node and basically describes a scenario where file upon execution makes an HTTP request to a remote URL. And it can be for various reasons. It may be download of additional payload. It can be posting stolen data from the compromised machine. It doesn't matter in this example. Let's go over another set of nodes and edges that describe host operations. By host operations, we mean here that every action that is done by the threat actor on the compromised machine. So let's say we have a very basic association between the host and the file, and fsrefs edge in this case basically means that the file was present on a machine. We store additional properties in this edge, in this fsrefs edge, where we capture, for example, creation time, and file path. So we can distinguish, for example, directories where certain threat actors store their files, drop their files, and execute them. Another example of a very basic edge between host and host is lat move edge, and it basically means that the threat actor moved from host A to host B. The last example of host ops is org host command edge, where we store information that particular host command was run on the host. Host command can be a cmd.exe, can be SQL command looking for data, anything that the malicious threat actor can execute on a host. Let's move on to some more meaningful example, and I will use a spear phishing example in this case. So there will be more nodes and more edges connected between them. Let's say we have an email address that sent an email to another email address. It has two files connected with the subfile edge, some sort of can mean that there is an attachment or a URL. Instead of sending attachment, the malicious threat actor sometimes send URLs for the victim to click on, right? But does this make sense to you guys? Because when I look at this set of nodes and edges, it actually makes little sense because there's something missing here in this modeling exercise. What is missing is the context information are missing, and I'm going to go through context, how we apply context information to our graph database so that the analysts can leverage this information later. You can see that all these nodes are annotated with like methodology, phish sender, there's a phish message in the middle, there's the victim of our spear phishing message, there's a payload, body, and additional payload if the threat actor chose to send a URL instead of attachment. Let's go through all these behaviors. The BHV aspect that you just saw stands for behavior. So we are capturing behavior of every malicious or non-malicious behavior are under this huge tree of different behaviors. This one captures the phishing exercise, and you can see that there is a description for sender. It's actually the email address that sent the message. There is the actual file or relevant headers. There's the victim, payload, and the body, so actual text of our spear phishing message. As I said before, the BHV stands for behavior, and this is the top aspect of our threat modeling, threat model, and you can see that there are sub-aspects like math. Math stands for methodology, and under this huge tree, we are capturing different methodologies. There is another sub-aspect called fish, and all our examples from this spearfishing exercise can be described by these set of aspects. Let me show you some other behavior trees that we are using in our database. And this is just an example because the tree has like dozens of thousands of different aspects. We already went through the fish aspect. We have our victim, sender, body, and the payload. But we also have something like file ops. And file ops basically pertains to any operations that the threat actor could do on a file, such as macro, for example. Very simple aspect that we apply to any file that has a macro inside. It can be XLS file, it can be doc file, whatever contains a macro. The other aspect would be obfuscation, and this pertains to any, let's say, string concatenation that Debo is working on. So we don't actually use obf, we use several sub-aspects that pertain to particular obfuscation technique like string concatenation. There's another tree that we are capturing context for host operations. So any activity done by malicious threat actor on the host. And a couple of examples would be wipe. This behavior would pertain to any commands that the attacker run in order to wipe the logs or wipe event logs. There's another example for data mining. So this aspect would be applied to any node that pertains to threat actor data mining, for example, looking for emails or looking for certain files, looking for certain records in the database. All these nodes would get this aspect. Let me quickly go through another subtree of our behavior aspect, and this pertains to capabilities of malware. So when we are modeling our malware samples, for example, if they have command and control capability with Twitter or GitHub, they would get these aspects applied to the malware nodes. There's another aspect called crypt, and it basically means that the file has capability to encrypt the data with either AES or RC4 or whatever encryption protocol it's using. We have much more than that. Data mine pertains to a malware that is able to, for example, look for certain files, or it's able to record the screen, or it's able to keylog the system. These set of aspects would be applied to every malware that have these sort of capabilities. Okay, we covered the behavior aspect. Let's quickly go through signature aspect. This is another tree that we are using in our database, where we, for example, capture CVEs from different years, and these aspects will be applied to malware that is exploiting certain vulnerability. Sometimes we are just using exploit if we are not sure. Sometimes, and the sig/mal aspect will have all these sub-aspects that pertain to particular malware families. So let's say we have SOGU or ZX shell. So sig/max SOGU would get every malware sample of this family would get this aspect. Let's go back to our spearfishing modeling exercise. We have this set of nodes connected with our edges. And you can see the payload here on the bottom right. This is our actual attachment in our spearfishing email. Let's take a look what kind of aspects it would get. Let's say that this attachment was sent with the file name payroll 2018 XLS. We have our metfish.payload. We analyzed the sample, discovered that this is actual foobar malware family, and we know that it contains a macro. There's another node, a subfile from this XLS file that will also get foobar malware family. We know that it's a macro because we extracted just the text version of the VB script, and we know that it's written in Visual Basic, so we applied code language VB script. This macro goes to a URL. Sorry, here. This macro goes to a URL. It's grabbing foo.exe sample that is also mal.foobar family. And here's our foo.exe. We've got our base name, foo.exe, foobar family. During reverse engineering process, we identified that is actual a code family for foobar. It's not obfuscated or encrypted, and it's a backdoor, and it has two capabilities of reaching out to its CNC by HTTP protocol, and it can also execute commands. The URL, this is not the finished modeling of this basic example. The URL is also connected to its FQDN that has its own registrar, and it has its own IP resolution address. Let's take a look at this example closer as we try to analyze this intrusion closer. We have our host. The foo.exe has its own command and control server with the different domain name than before. Of course, it has its own FQDN and the registrar, and this file was present on a host that we analyzed, the host from the person that received the spear phishing email. What we have seen later, after, let's say, 30 minutes of dropping this foo.exe file, that the host executed a command to go to actual URL and grabbed additional file, meow.exe, and upon analysis, we have discovered that it's just a Mimikatz publicly available tool. It's not real malware, right? So our host has this file, and after additional analysis, we have discovered additional dropped file, maybe 10, maybe 15 minutes later, and it's passwords.txt. It contains hashes, and it's present in CXYZ passwords txt file. Additional analysis revealed that there was another host command run. There was a ping request to our evil domain, and the attackers executed additional command using foo.exe. They basically sent the passwords to their CNC address. We've got our methexfil aspect because it pertains to exfiltration of data. And we've got our sigmal foobar aspect for foobar malware family. And I'm pretty sure that when you were following this spear phishing modeling, you get the idea that there is only one person responsible for it. They sent an attachment, they dropped their foo.exe file, and they downloaded Mimikatz, created passwords.txt with the hashes of the passwords, and exfiltrated it. We are pretty sure in this example, going from left to right, we have our set of IOCs, and we can pretty much know that we have really high confidence that it's either one person or one group. So we're going to attribute it to one entity. And this is the final aspect that I want to talk about, because it's the most important aspect. It's the APT, or some companies are using threat aspect. It basically pertains to attribution, and it's some sort of bee's knees of cyber threat modeling. It represents, analytical assessment that a set of indicator is used by particular group or threat actor. And there are several considerations in terms of attribution. You have to think about how your attribution framework, how rigid you want your attribution framework to be, because less rigid attribution framework means that we will make more mistakes in attributing intrusion sets. You have to think about analytic confidence, how confident you are that set of indicators belongs to a particular group or not. You have to think about correlation value of certain indicators of compromise, and you also have to think about the bias, because our brain works in a horribly biased way. I'm an analyst and I make mistakes every day. Our brain will always try to adapt to something. Whenever we are processing new information, we will always make assumptions based on what we have experienced in the past and based on what we know. And we will come up with a solution that we think it's true. And I will give you an example. I was following the APT32 group a couple of years ago. This is the nation-state-sponsored group from Vietnam. And they were using ActiveMime attachment. It's basically a text file that can be renamed from HTA to doc. And it contains macros, it contains OLE objects, everything, fully fledged spear phishing attachment. And I had a basic Yara rule on VirusTotal, and I was looking at literally every ActiveMime file that was present or uploaded to VirusTotal. And after a while, working on this APT32 group, whenever I saw an ActiveMime that had like 3 to 6 AV detections on VirusTotal, and that this file would have a Vietnamese-looking file name, my brain would literally tell me, hey, you have an APT32 example here. This will be fairly easy to attribute, right? But it's not always the case. Be mindful of that. So what happens when we can't really attribute something to a group that we were tracking, threat actor that we know about? We don't have any correlation between set A and set B. And we should be handing out UNCs like candy. UNC is an uncategorized group that we are using in our threat database. And this is the actual quote of our main developer of our threat intel database. And what it means is that I will show you our tree of APT aspect. It basically contains words APT1 to 37 and UNCs up to 1,000 something, 1,100. So we're tracking so many groups because we have very rigid attribution framework and we don't want to make these mistakes. So let's say that our spear phishing example that we just modeled is our UNC1. We are fairly confident that this is just one person or one group trying to compromise a machine, gather password hashes, and exfiltrate them. We have one email address, we've got 3 domain names, a couple of file names, 1 Mimikatz sample, and this is all UNC1 for us. Let's say that, I don't know, 2 weeks later, we had another intrusion from different email address using the same malware family, foobar. It's not XLS file anymore, it's just docx. The CNC, the command and control FQDN is completely different. The Mimikatz is not longer meow, it's mimi.exe, so nothing really stands out, right? We have only one malware family that is just used by these 2 groups. We would attribute it to UNC2. But let's say that after another day, they drop this file again, passwords.txt, in the same directory, right? We would still attribute it to UNC2. But we would come up with this, merging of two different ANCs. We would have use of foobar malware family that has quite low overlap confidence level. We would have the same stage directory where they drop passwords txt with medium confidence level, but when they exfil the file to the same FQDN, this is quite high and has very high correlation value. We would basically merge them together. And now I will give you an example from the front lines. I've been talking about theory for this whole presentation. Let's talk about some real stuff. We had an intrusion earlier this year. A couple of our clients were compromised, and we were responding to these intrusions. And the threat actors used two tools that were exclusively attributed to APT20 before. It's the Cetra backdoor, it's the Cetra proxy tool, and the cookie clog backdoor. And we were quite puzzled. We attributed to a new ANC because this group was dormant for us for over a year, and we didn't have any overlaps beside these two malware families. But we tried to wait a little bit more. We had our APT20 and our ANC, and we waited and tried to pivot from what we know and if we can find some overlaps. So later during the IR process, we got some more evidence, and we had our use of Cetra and cookie clog. This is very low overlap confidence level. They used the session token in their malware, and it was quite unique for APT20. But what they did as well is, you can see they used the RAR to compressed files for exfil, and they use a password that starts and ends with the bracket. There is a letter D, there is this hash that overlaps. They also used d.gif and d1.gif during exfiltration. So this was quite high confidence for us, and it had a really high correlation value to merge these two groups together. It was confirmed that it's APT20. Let me give you another example of our Intel support that we give to our managed defense SOCs. If you don't have a graph database, you can still pivot to something that is really on the internet and it's public, and I'm going to go through this example real quick. We discovered a piece of malware that was communicating over SSL, and we could see the requests and the responses were fairly the same in terms of size, so we knew that it's not the web browsing activity. There might be some backdoor behind it. Then later we ran live response. We discovered this ZX shell sample, and we analyzed it. And we saw that it used a very old and very unique OpenSSL that was bundled together with the ZX shell sample. So we wrote the SIG for this particular SSL client hello. We were waiting if we're gonna break up our company or not, because maybe there will be false positive storm. But we were quite lucky, and we started seeing traffic only on few IP addresses, and we started discovering all these CNCs that you see on the right. And all of them, they shared one serial number, one SSL certificate. After a couple of days, we saw another IP address with the same SSL certificate, and we do pivoting every day on every set of indicators, and we just saw this PDNS entries, Philippines News, Mu.com, secondphotoframe.com. These three FQDNs resolved this IP address in the past. And these three FQDNs were present in a Kaspersky report about the Helsing APT. We are actually tracking it as well, but this is just an example of how you can pivot, how you can use something and pivoting to get to public reporting about APT intrusions. Then later we also saw additional IP addresses on passive total and on census. So there was a bunch of malicious infrastructure behind it. This is the final. Final couple of slides of my talk, and I'm going to tell you what to do and what not to do if you want to launch your own cyber threat intelligence programs. I really have only 4 do's. You have to have threat intelligence personnel. Even 1 or 2 analysts will do, but they have to be dedicated to their work and to this particular task in your team. You have to have some reverse engineering capability either in the threat intelligence team or the SOC team or the CERT team. You also have to have tech stack that will allow you pushing signatures, both Snort and Yara. And the basic task, pivoting and context creation, can be really accomplished using 2 or 3 people in your threat intelligence team. The next steps would be definitely try to leverage graph database, and I recommend using open source Synapse database for this task. It doesn't come with the GUI, but it's very efficient. It's actually a hypergraph database, but this is a topic for a different presentation, I guess. In terms of don'ts, and this is something that I have seen across different companies, maybe not in Europe, but really one don't is just don't do newscaster threat intelligence where you buy a bunch of feeds, you combine them together and brief C-level executives periodically. Please don't do it. Instead, you just focus on the data you already have, leverage your SOC or IR practice. There's a lot of indicators that you can definitely use in terms of providing context of what's really targeting you as a company. Try to get access to some enrichment data sources, so passive DNS, SSL certificates, and WHOIS information. Try to hunt for attackers' activity, tag and describe what you see. And I guarantee you that if you keep pivoting, you will definitely find something like the example from Kaspersky Helsing report. That's all I had. I will be happy to answer some questions if you have.